Hi everybody. I'm going to start this second clip with a statement that I think is an important clarification for how we discuss government. I have often heard people say that certain branches of government have the right to do something, like Congress has the right to declare war, or the president has the right to be commander-in-chief. And this may sound like it's just a sort of a small difference that just deals specifically with semantics. But I think it's important to understand that government doesn't have rights. People have rights. Government has powers. In my mind, that's an important distinction. The reason that that's an important distinction is because when we say that we have rights, that means that some of our rights are protections from government. They're not all created by government. Some of our rights predate government, whereas government is more of a positive creation, meaning that when government is created, it is through specifically laws that are made by human beings. And that's called positive law, laws that are created by people for the organization of people. That's called positive law. The types of rights that I was talking about are called natural laws. So, power. Our Constitution creates several different types of powers for government. And this is an area that can be a little confusing for people. So, the first type of power that the Constitution creates is called enumerated powers. This one is fairly easy to understand. Enumerated powers are powers that literally appear printed in the Constitution itself. So that word enumerated means numbered or listed out. So for example, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution is where all of Congress's enumerated powers are, like the power to declare war. Congress has the power to tax. Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. These are all powers that are literally listed out in the Constitution. They're called enumerated powers. And that's easy to understand. If they're listed out specifically in the Constitution, then it's clear that Congress has that certain power. But this is where things get a little confusing. The Constitution also grants a second type of power, and those are called implied powers. Here's where we're going to talk about another clause. Remember, a clause simply is a group of words. This clause is called the necessary and proper clause. So, let me clarify. I just mentioned a section of the Constitution in passing called Article 1, Section 8. And that's where all of Congress's enumerated powers are. Again, those are powers that are all listed out. Congress has the power to declare war, to tax, to regulate interstate commerce, and a whole number of powers listed out. Well, at the end of that list, there is a clause called the necessary and proper clause. And I'm paraphrasing, but it basically says this. After listing out all these powers that Congress has, there's a statement at the end that says, and Congress has the power to do all things, that's a big word, all, to do all things necessary and proper in bringing about these previous powers. That is a broad set of words. You see, confusion is created in our Constitution because sometimes words are very clear, like the word no appears in the Constitution. It's a very clear word. But then there are sometimes parts of the Constitution, I should say, that are much more broad, are much more vague, like this clause called the necessary and proper clause. So, an example of implied power is that it literally says in the Constitution as an enumerated power that Congress has the power to build an army and a navy. Okay, it says that in the Constitution. Doesn't say anything about an Air Force. Yet, nobody seems to mind that we have an army and a navy, and then we also have this thing called an Air Force. But it says nothing in the Constitution about American government having the power to create an Air Force. But you could say that if Congress has the power to create an army and a navy and provide for the common defense, which the Constitution says, then by extension, it's implied that Congress also has the power to create an Air Force. So for those of you perhaps that aren't familiar with that word implied, to imply something means to say something without literally saying it. That's what it means to imply something. To say it without literally saying it. So the Constitution literally says certain things, but you can also imply certain things from what the Constitution literally says. So, first type of power is called enumerated powers. Those are powers that literally appear in the Constitution. The second are called implied powers, and those are powers that are created through the necessary and proper clause. A third type of power that our Constitution creates is called concurrent powers. Concurrent powers are powers that are shared by the federal government and the states. If something is concurrent, that word means it happens at the same time. So there are certain powers that both the federal government and all of the individual states have concurrently at the same time. So, what are some examples of these concurrent powers? I'll bet there's one that you could think of right away if you put your mind to it, and that is the power to tax. The federal government has the power to tax, and so do the states. Congratulations, if you live in California, you have the right, and government has the power on the federal level to make you pay income tax, but also you pay income tax to the states, right? That is a concurrent power. Both the federal government and the states have the power to tax. They also concurrently have the power to create a police force. We have federal law enforcement like the FBI, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, the ATF. We have I don't know. What's the word? What's what I'm thinking of? The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration. And at the state level and at the local level, we obviously have law enforcement as well. So it's a concurrent power to be able to create a police force, to create a court system. There's a federal court system, and each state has its own state court systems. A concurrent power is the power to create prisons. Unfortunately, we have a lot of those in our country. There are federal prisons, and then there are also state prisons. So each state can make its own prisons, and the federal government can make its own prisons as well. Again, those are concurrent powers. So, number 1, enumerated. Number 2, implied. Number 3, concurrent. And then number 4 are called reserved powers. Reserved powers are powers that are reserved for the states. And that's in the 10th Amendment of our Constitution, is what's called the Reservation Clause. That's why these powers are called reserved powers. The Reservation Clause states, and again I'm paraphrasing, that any laws not specifically granted only to the federal government, or rather any powers, I should say, not laws, any powers specifically that aren't specifically granted to the federal government or aren't prevented by the Constitution are reserved for the states. So again, I'll repeat that because I kind of flubbed it. It is any powers that aren't specifically only granted to the federal government and aren't prevented by the Constitution are reserved for the states. So for example, an example of a reserved power is the driving age. Different states have different ages under which one can legally drive a car. That's a power that is reserved for the states. So, enumerated, implied, concurrent, and reserved. Those are the 4 types of powers that are created through the Constitution. See you next clip.